Hello, my name is Roy Childs. I'm a chartered psychologist, and this video can help with both the giving and receiving of feedback. And you'll get more out of this video if you reflect and remember some of your own personal experiences of receiving feedback, whether it was direct, spoken, written, or structured from a psychometric questionnaire or 360-degree feedback. So I suggest you pause the video and write down a few thoughts about those experiences. Were the experiences you wrote down positive or negative? Did they make you feel hurt, sad, or angry? I have found that people usually associate the word feedback with negative experiences, at least initially. Now, of course, feedback can be positive. Did you write down experiences that made you feel happy or strong? Positive feedback usually gives people a boost, although this may only be temporary. Negative feedback can make people feel defensive, which then leads to either rejecting the information or attacking the source of the feedback. Think of yourself as having a window onto the world. Sometimes feedback is what we already know, it is clear. But sometimes feedback is a surprise. Some ideas or perceptions of ourselves may be a little unclear. And sometimes we get feedback that we don't even recognise at all. This is a way of understanding the Johari window. So let me describe it in a little more detail. I will then go on to describe how it can be used most effectively. But let me begin with where this strange name came from. Idiosyncratically, it was chosen by two psychologists who produced it as a self-help tool. So Joseph Lunt and Harrington Ingham, known as Joe and Harry, merged their names to become Johari. And the Johari window is a 4-box model. Clearly, there are things that we all know about ourselves and which others do too. Johari calls this the public self. Then there are aspects of myself which I keep private. But there are also things that I believe about me, but which are either inaccurate or of which I am unaware. Johari calls this the blind spot. And this leaves the 4th box for what is currently unknown, perhaps the unconscious, yet to be discovered, or some unrealized potential. Feedback is an opportunity to consider each of these. We increase self-awareness by moving this line, reducing the blind spot, and being more open, which moves this line, thus reducing the private, which is often a way of building stronger relationships. And both of these often result in moving this line, which reduces the unknown, which can release creativity and unrealized potential. Now, explaining Johari makes people more willing to listen without rejecting either surprising or negative feedback. You can think of feedback as analogous to gardening. Consider a person is like a seed, full of potential and ready to grow, but the seed does not grow as well without preparing the soil, and a person does not grow without being prepared to listen and learn. This means not reacting defensively, not rejecting surprises. If the person is prepared, then feedback can act like a fertilizer. It stimulates curiosity rather than defensiveness. And if the person disagrees with the feedback, rather than criticize the source, perhaps the person or a questionnaire, I will encourage them to ask themselves, I wonder why, or I wonder what makes people see me like that. And another tool to prepare people is called the FURR model. Whenever we receive feedback, it always feeds into a pre-existing self-concept, which is often quite resistant to change. So the F in FURR stands for frozen. Feedback which affirms this pre-existing view may be completely correct and helps to build the credibility of the feedback source. But all development is predicated on change. Hence it is feedback that contradicts or challenges this pre-existing self-concept that enables some unfreezing. Challenging feedback is the heat that can unfreeze if we are open to it. It means transforming a natural defensive reaction or rejection and allows us to reconsider. I call it reformulation. For this, to happen, a person needs to react by asking himself, I wonder why it's suggesting that, and I wonder if it could be true. And this leads to the last R in FURR, which stands for refreezing, or I prefer to call it reframing. This means changing the way that people understand themselves. And I have found that introducing FURR makes people less defensive, more receptive to challenging feedback, and hence more willing to consider potential blind spots, as suggested in Johari. This approach to feedback can underline what is called the 1% rule. And no matter how far off the mark feedback may seem, there is always 1% of truth in it. Exploring that 1% is usually more useful than simply rejecting it. So I will now go on to illustrate the use of Johari Window with a practical example. I will use the Team Focus Emotional Intelligence questionnaire, which has got 3 domains: personal, relational and situational intelligence. And each domain is divided into 3, which gives 9 major areas. Each of these have 2 subdivisions, which ends up then with 18 competencies. The report provides an overview using the 9 major areas, which looks like this. Peter's belief is shown by the blue columns, and we can see that he rated himself as grade C on situational awareness. A person, David, was chosen to give him feedback, and we can see that he has given Peter a D rating, lower than Peter sees himself. Having previously explained the value of surprises to Peter using FURR, Peter can now consider reasons for David's rating. Perhaps Peter is not as good at reading social situations as he thinks he is. Perhaps it's a blind spot. Or perhaps David does not know him well enough. David does not see Peter in the range of situations where that skill is obvious, which makes it more private. The EIQ report then goes into more detail. It presents this information using all 18 competencies in the Johari window like this. This shows all 18 competencies, and where David and Peter agree, they appear in the public box. But where there is a difference in perception, they are placed in the blind spot box. Peter is then asked to consider or discuss whether they can be moved from the blind spot to the private box. If Peter claims it is just private, he can consider any potential benefit from making it more public. Now obviously David could be wrong or unobservant, but usually the co-respondent is chosen because their opinion is valued. It may be that David does not see Peter in a sufficiently wide range of situations for the skill to become obvious, which means that the feedback may simply reflect the nature of their relationship. To summarise, with the paired version of the EIQ, we can allocate perceptions where both agree. But where there is disagreement, we start with the hypothesis that it is a blind spot, and we then consider whether it would be more accurate to consider them as private or even unconscious. With good preparation, defensiveness is reduced, giving a chance for feedback to increase self-awareness. I have applied this idea to self-report questionnaires, and instead of treating such questionnaires as objective measures, it is useful and more realistic to simply recognise that they are helping people to articulate their belief about themselves. And using the paired process to receive feedback from a third party helps people look inside themselves, to be unmasked. And while this is potentially challenging, using FURR and Johari can make the process much more positive and useful. I hope that has been useful, and if you are interested in accessing the paired versions of various questionnaires, Emotional Intelligence EIQ, the Values-Based Indicator of Motivation VBIM, or the Type Dynamics Indicator TDI, do feel free to contact us using the details on the screen. Thank you.